She cannot understand German, Lord Frederick Vale said loudly, deliberately, with the kind of smile that expects no consequences. Every head at that dinner table turned toward Eleanor Harrington, Duchess of Ashcombe, waiting for the flush of humiliation to rise in her cheeks. She picked up her fork instead. She took a calm, unhurried bite, and then she answered him in flawless German without once looking up from her plate. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better, stay with this story. Subscribe to our channel and tell us in the comments, what city are you watching from tonight? The invitations had gone out 3 weeks before the dinner, and every family of consequence in Yorkshire had accepted them. Not because Edward Harrington, Duke of Ashcombe, was known for his warmth as a host. He was not. His dinners were precise, formal, and brief, the kind of evenings where the wine was excellent and the conversation was tolerated rather than enjoyed. Men came to his table because refusing the Duke of Ashcombe was an act of social courage that very few in the county possessed, and women came because their husbands brought them, and because the Harrington dining room had the finest silver service in the north of England, and there was always something worth describing to the neighbors afterward. But this particular evening was different. Everyone in Yorkshire knew it before the carriages had even finished rolling through the gates. Tonight was not a dinner. It was an exhibition. Eleanor Whitmore Harrington, newly made Duchess of Ashcombe, would be presented to Yorkshire society for the first time since the marriage had been formalized 6 weeks prior. And Yorkshire society, which had spent those 6 weeks trading every whispered detail it could extract from servants, solicitors, and the occasional loose-tongued clerk, had arrived tonight with its collective appetite thoroughly sharpened. They knew what she was. They had made certain of it. She was the daughter of the Earl of Northumberland, or rather, the former Earl of Northumberland, a man whose title had survived considerably longer than his finances. The Whitmore name was old and respectable, and currently attached to debts that would have embarrassed a shipping clerk, let alone a peer. The estate at Whitmore Valley was the last remaining asset of any significance, and it had been spoken for acquired, technically the moment. Edward Harrington had reviewed the county maps and understood what the valley's position meant for the rail corridor he intended to extend northward. Coal moved faster when the terrain cooperated. Edward understood terrain. He understood less those who watched him tonight would privately note about the woman now seated to his left. Eleanor had arrived in the drawing room 20 minutes before the other guests, which Edward had neither requested nor expected. She wore a gown the color of deep midnight, not the pale pastels that young women of her age and situation generally favored, as if softness of color might communicate softness of character, might remind men that they were unthreatening. The color she had chosen communicated nothing of the sort. Her dark hair was arranged with minimal ornamentation. She wore the Harrington pearls, the old ones, the ones his mother had worn because she had been told they were the appropriate choice for a first formal appearance, as Duchess, and Eleanor Whitmore Harrington had always understood the difference between what she preferred and what the occasion demanded. Edward had not expected her to understand that distinction quite so clearly. He had looked at her standing near the window in the drawing room, the pearls at her throat, her posture entirely composed, and he had felt something he could not immediately identify. Not attraction, or not only that. Something closer to the unsettling recognition that the arrangement he had made might be more complicated than the ledger entry he had mentally filed it under. He had dismissed the feeling before the first guest arrived. The Vales came first, as the Vales always did, because Lord Frederick Vale operated on the social calendar as though punctuality were a form of dominance. He was 41, broad across the chest, with a voice that had been trained since boyhood to carry across large rooms. He was the kind of man who laughed at his own observations before he had finished making them, and who had never once in his adult life entered a room without scanning it to determine who posed a threat and who could be safely ignored. He scanned Eleanor once. He filed her under the second category. His sister, Lady Margaret, arrived on his arm and performed the introductions with the brisk efficiency of a woman who attended too many of these evenings and had long since stopped pretending to find them interesting. She was thinner than her brother and sharper in the eyes, and she assessed Eleanor with the quick clinical attention of someone pricing goods at auction, taking in the gown, the pearls, the posture, the absence of the kind of fashionable anxiety that usually attended a young woman's first appearance in a room like this. Whatever conclusion Lady Margaret drew from that assessment she kept behind her teeth. The remaining guests arrived in the following half hour. The Morehursts, the elder Lord Cavendish and his considerably younger wife, the Ashby brothers, Sir William Graves, who had ridden in from his estate near Harrogate specifically for the occasion, and had informed 2 separate people of this fact within the first 10 minutes of his arrival. 22 in total. Every seat at the Harrington table filled, and every person in every seat arrived knowing something that Eleanor did not yet know they knew. They had decided what she was before she walked into the room. The dining room was lit by 40 candles, the table laid with the precision that Edward's housekeeper, Mrs. Calloway, had maintained for 11 years. The conversation during the first course moved along the established channels. Local politics, the rail expansion, the unfortunate hunting season, the Queen's continuing health, and Eleanor sat and listened, and ate with the quiet competence of a woman who knew when to be still. Edward watched her from the corner of his attention, the way he watched everything he had recently acquired. Cataloging, assessing. She asked Lord Cavendish a question about his estate's water rights, and the old man answered with more animation than he had shown all evening. She listened to Mrs. Morehurst describe her daughter's recent season in London, and said precisely the right thing in response, sympathetic without condescension, interested without performance. She did not fill silence with chatter. She did not seek approval with her eyes. Edward reached for his wine. Howe was beginning to revise something, though he could not yet say what. It was Lord Frederick who changed the temperature of the room. He did it at the transition between the fish course and the meat course, when the footmen were moving, and the conversation had reached one of its natural pauses. He turned to his sister Margaret, seated 2 chairs down from Eleanor, and he said something in German. He said it in a conversational tone. Relaxed. The tone of a man sharing a private observation with a family member in a crowded room, confident that privacy was guaranteed by language. What he said translated was this: "Poor Edward. His Duchess has beautiful table manners and nothing behind the eyes. He married a Whitmore, he got a wall decoration." Lady Margaret made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but functioned as one. She answered in kind, something about the pearls being wasted on a woman who clearly did not understand what she was wearing. Edward heard the tone of it. He heard the register, the lazy, dismissive cadence that certain people use when they believe the subject of their commentary is comprehensively beyond the conversation. He had heard that register directed at servants, at tradesmen, at individuals. Frederick Vale had decided did not warrant the effort of actual contempt. He looked at Eleanor. I expected, he realized afterward, that he had expected something specific, though he could not have articulated it in advance. Confusion, perhaps. The particular stillness of a person who can hear that something unkind is being said about them, but cannot access the specifics. The small private humiliation of knowing you are being mocked without knowing the content of the mockery, which is in its way its own particular cruelty. Eleanor was cutting her meat. The knife moved with unhurried precision. She set it down. She lifted her fork. She brought it to her mouth. Lord Frederick, interpreting this stillness as confirmation of his assessment, said something further to his sister. His voice was louder now, not loud enough to address the table, but loud enough that the guests nearest him could hear the German syllables, if not parse them. He was performing, Eleanor understood, for a local audience. The joke landed better with witnesses. Margaret leaned slightly forward to respond. Eleanor set down her fork. Not with force. With the same measured deliberateness she had applied to everything since she walked into this room. She looked at Lord Frederick Vale. Not quickly, not nervously, the direct level gaze of someone who has determined that a thing needs to be addressed and has decided the moment has arrived. And she answered him. In German. She said, "My lord, I find that walls rarely have opinions on water rights, coal distribution, or the rail corridor's projected return on capital. But I confess, I have heard otherwise intelligent men mistake silence for vacancy before. It is a surprisingly common error." The sound that followed was not silence exactly. It was the specific pressurized quality of a room in which 22 people have simultaneously stopped producing. Noise, stopped mid-sentence, mid-chew, mid-breath, and are now recalibrating everything they understood about the current situation. Lord Frederick's expression did something complicated. The easy confidence drained first. Then came the flush high on the cheeks, the involuntary physical response of a man who has just understood that he miscalculated something important. He said nothing. Eleanor turned back to her plate. She was not finished eating. Lady Margaret, to her credit, recovered marginally faster than her brother. She said something in a lower voice, still German, still directed at Eleanor. Though the register had shifted entirely, the lazy contempt replaced by something cautious and probing. She asked obliquely carefully where Eleanor had studied. "I did not study." Eleanor answered in the same language, still in the same calm conversational tone she might have used to discuss the weather. "I read. My father's library was extensive, and there was a great deal of time in Northumberland that required filling." She switched to French. She did it without announcement, without transition, in the middle of a sentence that happened to require a term that sat more precisely in the French vocabulary, and she did it with the same naturalness that a person switches hands when carrying something heavy. One of the Ashby brothers, seated 4 places down, a young man who had been educated on the continent, looked up sharply. He said something in French. Eleanor answered him. They exchanged 3 or 4 sentences about a philosophical text she had apparently read in the original, and his expression moved through surprise and into something that looked very much like genuine interest. Edward had stopped eating. He was watching his wife with the particular quality of attention he applied to things that required reassessment, the same focused stillness he brought to contracts that contained provisions he had initially misread to maps that revealed terrain he had not accounted for. He was thinking about the bridge. He had not thought about the bridge in 2 weeks. It had been an incident, and he had filed it as such. A fortunate observation. A woman who had grown up on a failing estate and absorbed by proximity some practical knowledge about structural repair. Lucky, he had told himself. Circumstantial. He was reconsidering that assessment. Lord Cavendish had said something to Eleanor in Italian. Lord Cavendish, who spent 3 months every year in Florence, and who considered his Italian a distinguishing personal achievement. And Eleanor had answered him in kind, and the old man was now leaning forward with an expression Edward had genuinely never seen on his face at one of these dinners, which was the expression of a man who has unexpectedly found himself in a conversation he finds genuinely worthwhile. She said something that made him laugh. A real laugh, not the social bark that men of his station deployed when they were expected to find something amusing, but the unguarded, slightly surprised sound of a person who has heard something genuinely clever. The table had shifted. Edward could feel it the way you feel a change in atmospheric pressure, not in any single element, but in the aggregate, in the altered posture of 22 people who had arrived with a fixed understanding of this room and were now quietly and not entirely comfortably updating it. Frederick Vale had not spoken since Eleanor's response. He was eating with concentrated attention, as though the meat course were the most demanding document he had encountered in recent memory. Lady Margaret had positioned herself in conversation with Mrs. Morehurst, and was performing engagement with admirable commitment. Sir William Graves, who had ridden in from Harrogate specifically to observe the Duke's new reportedly mediocre wife, was staring at Eleanor with an expression that contained several emotions in rapid succession, none of them the one he'd arrived with. Eleanor was explaining something to young Ashby about the structure of trade agreements between the German states and France, not in an instructional tone, but with the natural momentum of a person engaged in a topic they have genuinely thought about making a point and then refining it, asking a question of her own, listening to the answer, and building on it. She was not performing intelligence. Edward understood this with sudden, uncomfortable clarity. She was simply intelligent. She had always been simply intelligent. And the room had arrived expecting to find something else, and was now occupied with the disorienting business of encountering reality where it had expected a surface. He thought, when did I decide what she was? He knew when. He knew precisely when. He had reviewed the terms of the land agreement and appended to them automatically and without examination a set of assumptions about the person attached to the land. He had looked at the conditions of the Whitmore estate and deduced from them what Eleanor Whitmore must be: the daughter of failure, the ornament of a transaction, the respectable wife his advisors told him he needed and his title technically required. He had looked at the woman who had identified the fault in the bridge drawings before any of his men before him, and he had told himself she was fortunate. He had not said it to her. He had not said anything to her. He had stood beside her while she explained the structural issue to the foreman. Watched the foreman follow her instructions, with the careful attention of a man who has concluded against prior expectation that the instructions are correct, and he had offered no acknowledgement, no credit, nothing but the barest courtesy of a man who has been marginally inconvenienced by being wrong. He had gotten into the carriage afterward, and returned to the business of Ashcombe, as though the afternoon had been merely administrative. She had not complained about it. She had not in 6 weeks of marriage complained about anything. She had moved into Ashcombe Manor and learned its rhythms with the quiet competence of a woman who understood that a new position required new knowledge and had set about acquiring it without fanfare. She had not attempted to alter the household routines without consultation. She had not inserted herself into conversations about the estate that she had not been invited into. She had been by every measure Edward had applied, the perfectly respectable wife he had specified in his mental ledger. He had interpreted this as compliance. He was now asking himself whether he had been wrong about that too. The dessert course arrived. The conversation had rearranged itself around Eleanor the way water arranges itself around a new stone, not violently, not with announcement, but with the inexorable logic of a medium that always finds the most accurate path. Sir William had engaged her on the subject of the Yorkshire rail expansion, and she was outlining clearly, and without condescension, the economic implications of the Northern Corridor in a way that made Sir William's expression cycle through surprised skepticism, and then the specific, slightly reluctant focus of a man who has realized he is hearing something he ought to be writing down. Lord Frederick had made one attempt to re-enter the conversation. He had said something in English this time with careful attention to neutral territory about the difficulties of managing large estates with absentee oversight. It was a comment aimed imprecisely at something. Eleanor had looked at him with the same level, unalarmed attention she applied to everything, and agreed that absentee oversight produced predictable inefficiencies, and mentioned almost as an aside 3 specific examples from northern estates, where the pattern had resulted in measurable financial loss. She knew the examples. She knew the figures. Frederick had retreated again. Edward noticed that Eleanor did not look at Frederick with triumph when she answered him. She did not look at him with anything in particular. She addressed the question and returned her attention to the broader conversation. She was not, he understood, performing for him. She was not doing this to impress the Duke or to demonstrate something to the room. She was simply herself, and the room was adjusting to that fact. He had a thought then, a thought he would not examine fully until much later, until the guests had gone, and the candles had been put out, and the house had settled into its night sounds, which was this. He had decided on the basis of a land agreement and a set of social assumptions about bankrupt earls and their daughters that he understood Eleanor Whitmore. He had assigned her a category and a set of limitations and a role, and he had proceeded to treat her accordingly with the distant adequate courtesy of a man who has met his contractual obligations and considers the matter settled. And she had said nothing. She had not corrected him. She had not protested or petitioned or arranged for him to discover his error. She had simply gone on being what she was. In rooms he was barely paying attention to. Waiting though not waiting, he thought. Not the passive waiting of someone who needed rescue, simply existing at her full depth, whether or not he was present enough to perceive it. The question that arrived in his mind at the end of that thought was quiet, but it had weight. What else had he missed? The dinner ended. The guests moved toward the drawing room. Edward walked beside Eleanor through the corridor, and she was speaking with Lady Cavendish about something. He caught the words Venetian glass and the original production method, and Lady Cavendish was nodding with the absorbed attention of someone in the presence of a subject they had long been curious about and never found a sufficient authority for, and Edward walked beside his wife and said nothing. How was recalibrating? When the last guest had gone, when the carriages had rolled back through the gates and the footman had begun extinguishing the dining room candles, Edward found himself in the corridor outside the drawing room in the particular stillness that a house achieves after it has held too many people for too many hours. Eleanor was at the far end of the corridor. She had stopped at the window there, the one that looked north across the grounds toward the tree line, and she was standing with her back to him, and the pearls at her throat caught the last of the candlelight from the hall sconce in a way that made them glow. He could have gone to his study. That was what he did after dinners retreated to the study, with whatever correspondence had accumulated, let the evening close behind him like a door. Instead, he walked toward her. She heard him. She did not turn immediately, but her posture acknowledged him, the slight adjustment of a person who has become aware they are no longer alone and is making space for that fact. He stopped a few feet from her. Outside the grounds were still. He did not say, "I did not know you spoke German." He did not say, "I underestimated you." He said, "You knew what he was saying, from the beginning." Eleanor turned from the window. "Yes." "You said nothing." There was nothing to say. Not then. The simplicity of it was he found more effective than any accusation would have been. "He has influence in 3 counties," Edward said. "Not as justification, as a statement of fact. I know what his influence is worth." She looked at him directly. "And now he knows what mine is." Edward was quiet for a moment. "You were not going to tell me about any of it. You're French, you're Italian. You did not ask," Eleanor said. "You asked for a respectable wife. I endeavored to be one." The words were not cruel. They were, if anything, very carefully neutral, the careful neutrality of a woman who has learned to keep things separate, who has understood that the contents of her own mind are hers to manage, and the Duke does not require inventory of them unless he requests it. That was the thing he had done. He understood it now, standing in the corridor in the aftermath of the evening with the house settling around them. He had established the terms of this marriage as a transaction, and she had met every one of those terms with complete and absolute precision, and he had been so occupied with the transaction that he had entirely failed to consider the person conducting it. He had married her land. He had not yet in any meaningful way married her. "Good night, Your Grace," Eleanor said. She moved past him toward the stairs, and he stood in the corridor and let her go and listened to her footsteps on the marble as they grew quieter and then were gone. He stood there for quite a long time after that. The candle in the sconce above him guttered once in a draught from somewhere and almost went out and then steadied. I was not the sort of man who revisited decisions. His entire life had been organized around the principle that decisions made carefully in advance did not require revisitation. He was going to have to make an exception. He did not sleep that night. Edward Harrington, Duke of Ashcombe, had built his entire adult life on the discipline of compartmentalization, the ability to place a problem in its proper drawer, close it and return to it when the schedule permitted. It was the same discipline that had allowed him to inherit a duchy at 23, manage a coal operation that employed 400 men, negotiate 3 railway contracts in 18 months, and maintain through all of it the composed exterior that Yorkshire society had come to regard as simply his nature. Cold, they said. Precise. A man who felt nothing he had not budgeted for in advance. He lay in the dark of his bedroom and thought about his wife, not with desire, or not only with desire, which would have been simpler, cleaner, easier to file. He thought about what he had seen tonight with the specific, restless energy of a man who has discovered an error in a calculation he was certain he had performed correctly. He ran it backward. The dinner, the German, the French, the Italian. Cavendish's laugh, that unguarded, genuine laugh that the old man produced perhaps twice a year in Edward's presence, and had produced tonight within 40 minutes of sitting beside Eleanor. Ashby's expression when they discussed the philosophical text. Sir William Graves pulling out his pocket notebook. His pocket notebook. Sir William had written something down. Edward pressed his thumb against the bridge of his nose. He thought about the bridge. He had thought about the bridge more in the last 3 hours than he had in the 2 weeks since it happened. And what he thought about specifically was not the bridge itself, but his response to what Eleanor had done. She had looked at the drawings. She had identified in under 2 minutes an error that his foreman, a man with 30 years of experience in Yorkshire construction, had missed entirely. She had explained the error clearly, with specific reference to load distribution and material grade, in the kind of language that came from actual understanding, and not from the performance of it. And he had asked her how she would know. He had asked it in exactly the tone a man uses when he is not actually asking a question, but expressing a verdict. She had told him someone had to learn what men ignored. He had heard that. He had registered it. and then he had set it aside like a footnote in a document he was not required to examine further because it was easier. It was considerably easier to call her fortunate than to ask what else she knew that he hadn't thought to ask about. He got out of bed before the household was awake. He went to the study, not to work, but to think, which he rarely did in the study, because the study was for working, but tonight the distinction had collapsed. He sat at the desk and looked at the window and thought about Eleanor Whitmore and what she had told him about herself during the 6 weeks of this marriage. The sum of it was almost nothing. Not because she had been evasive, she had answered every direct question he had put to her with accuracy and without elaboration. But he had not put many direct questions. He had told himself the arrangement did not require intimacy, and had therefore not pursued it, and Eleanor characteristically had not offered what had not been requested. I thought I know the acreage of her father's estate to 3 decimal places. I know the debt-to-asset ratio of the Whitmore holdings as of 18 months ago. I know the water table depth in the valley and the projected mineral yield from the eastern flank. I do not know how she learned German. He stayed in the study until Mrs. Calloway began her morning rounds, and then he went down to breakfast. Eleanor was already at the table. This was itself a small surprise. Edward kept early hours by the standards of his class, and he had not expected her to be awake yet, let alone seated and reading. She had a letter in one hand and a cup of tea in the other, and the morning paper folded on the table beside her plate, and she looked up when he entered with the same composed attention she applied to everything, as though finding him at the breakfast table at 7:30 on a Thursday morning were entirely within the range of anticipated events. "Good morning, Your Grace." He sat. He poured his coffee. He looked at her across the table. "How did you learn German?" She set the letter down. "My mother spoke it," she answered. "Her family was from Hamburg, originally 3 generations back. She taught me when I was young. French came from books. Mostly there was a tutor for a time, but we could not afford him past my 12th year, and I had already decided I wanted to read the originals, so I continued alone. Italian came later. I spent a summer with a family in Florence when I was 18. My father thought the change in climate might improve my constitution." She said all of this in the same measured tone she might have used to describe the contents of a cupboard. Not defensively. Not with the particular carefully managed brightness of a woman who has waited a long time to be asked a question and is now deploying the answer with strategic precision. Just clearly. Just accurately. Because he had asked. "You read political theory," Edward said. "I read everything available to me. The library at Whitmore was not systematically assembled. My grandfather bought in bulk, and my father never disposed of anything, so the range was considerable. I did not choose what was there. I simply read it." "Ashby asked you about Kant." "He asked about a particular essay. I had read it. In the original German. The translations I had access to were incomplete." Edward looked at her. He was doing the arithmetic again, faster this time, with more variables than he had known to include 2 weeks ago. He was recalculating. "Why did you not mention any of this?" The question was honest, more honest perhaps than he usually permitted himself in conversation. He asked it because he genuinely did not know the answer, and because he was, he realized now, genuinely curious about it. Eleanor picked up her teacup. "You did not ask about me, Your Grace. You asked about my father's estate, the acreage, the mineral rights, and the condition of the fencing along the northern boundary. Those things I told you. I assumed the interview was complete." The interview. He repeated the word internally. It sat there with the particular precision of a word chosen not to wound, but to accurately describe. And it wounded more for that. The clinical truthfulness of it. The word she had used for the 2 meetings they'd had before the wedding, that Edward had thought of as conversations, and Eleanor had apparently understood more clearly for what they were. He put down his coffee cup. "That was not all I wished to know." Eleanor looked at him over the rim of her teacup. "Then you have the same remedy now that you had then, Your Grace." A pause that was not unkind, but was absolutely level. "You may ask." Something shifted between them in that moment. Not dramatically, not with the theatrical weight of a scene from a novel, but with the quiet irreversibility of a door that has opened and cannot be closed in the same way again. He felt it. He believed watching her face that she felt it too, though her expression gave away precisely as much as she chose, and no more. "Tell me about Whitmore Valley," he said. "Not the acreage, not the mineral rights." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Tell you what specifically? What it was like to grow up there." She looked at him for a beat longer than she usually looked at anything. Not with uncertainty, but with the particular attention of a person taking the measure of a request, determining whether it is genuine. Whatever she found in his face, it satisfied her. She set the teacup down. She began to talk. She talked for 40 minutes, and Edward did not interrupt once. She told him about the house, not as a structure, but as a living thing, the way houses are to people who have spent their childhoods in them, with particular rooms that meant particular things, and particular seasons that changed its character entirely. She told him about her father, who had been brilliant and careless in equal measure, who had loved his books more than his accounts, and who had passed that love directly to his daughter along with a talent for languages and a complete inability to manage a quarterly budget. She did not say these things with bitterness. She said them with the clear-eyed affection of a person who has had a long time to understand someone and has arrived at an accommodation with what they found. She told him about learning to read the estate's structural reports because no one else was going to do it. Her father's estate manager had been honest but limited, and Eleanor had understood by the time she was 16 that if the Whitmore fencing was going to be assessed accurately, she was going to have to learn enough to assess it herself. She had extended this understanding to the water drainage, the mill equipment, the grain storage. Not because anyone told her to, because the alternative was watching the estate collapse slightly faster than it was already collapsing, and that seemed to her an insufficient reason for ignorance. She talked about the library, about the summer in Florence, about her mother who had died when Eleanor was 14, and whose German letters she still had in a box that had made the move to Ashcombe. 36 letters written over 20 years. The only thing in the Whitmore house that Eleanor had been categorically unwilling to leave behind. She told him that she had known when the marriage arrangement was proposed what it was. She did not say this as an accusation. She said it the way she said everything plainly, with the precision of a woman who found clarity more useful than comfortable revision. "I knew what you needed," Eleanor said. "Land and access, and a wife who would not create difficulty. I could provide those things. The arrangement made sense. And that was sufficient. I did not require more than that, Your Grace. I required security. I required my father's debts to stop accumulating. I required the knowledge that the servants at Whitmore who had been unpaid for 4 months would be paid. Those were the things that mattered." Edward was quiet. "You could have asked for more." "More was not on offer." She looked at him directly. "I understood the terms." He felt that like a hand pressed flat against something bruised. He had offered her terms. He had written them out in the careful language of a legal document and considered the matter settled. He had not asked what she needed. He had assumed that the needs of a bankrupt earl's daughter were simple, and that his ability to address them was itself a form of generosity that required no supplementing. He had not been wrong about the mathematics of it. He had been wrong about whether mathematics was sufficient. "The bridge," he said. Eleanor did not react with surprise to the change of subject. She simply redirected her attention. "What about it? You identified the fault in under 2 minutes. The drawings were unclear," she said. "But the error in the load calculation was visible once I looked at the support configuration. I had seen a similar problem at Whitmore, the Eastern Barn, 12 years ago. The foreman then made the same recommendation: replace rather than repair. It was not dishonest necessarily. It is simply the reflex of a man who defaults to the more expensive solution when uncertain. Because it protects him if something goes wrong afterward." "Exactly." She paused. "You should audit your contractor agreements. At least 3 of the ongoing projects on the Ashcombe estate have the same structural clause: cost overruns revert to the estate above a certain threshold. It creates a particular incentive." Edward looked at her. He said, "Which 3? She told him. "The mill renovation, the North Road, resurfacing the drainage project in the lower fields." She cited the clause language from memory, not word for word, but close enough that he knew she had read the documents, had read them carefully, and had retained what mattered. When did you read those agreements? Mrs. Calloway showed me the estate file room in my second week, Eleanor said. I thought it was reasonable to understand what I had come into. He stood up. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her for a moment, not in anger, but in the particular way of a man who needs a moment of stillness to absorb the reconfiguration of something he thought was fixed. Then he turned around. I would like you to come to the estate meeting on Friday, he said, with Hartley and the contractors. Eleanor looked at him. You are certain? My estate manager is competent and loyal. He is not, I think, as rigorous as he ought to be about contractor incentives. A second reading of the agreements would not go amiss. Your contractors will not be accustomed to a woman at that table. No, Edward agreed. They will not be. Something moved across Eleanor's face, brief and quickly mastered, but he caught it. Not triumph. Closer to the careful, measured release of tension from a person who has been holding it in a specific configuration for a long time, as though she had not quite allowed herself to believe this was a door that would open. Very well, she said. Friday. She picked up her letter again. He picked up his coffee. The morning went on around them. He did not return to the study immediately. He sat at the breakfast table longer than he usually did, reading the newspaper with less attention than he usually gave it, and Eleanor sat across from him, reading her letter, and occasionally making a small notation in the margin of the paper beside her, a habit he observed of someone who encounters information and instinctively records what matters. And they did not speak further, but the quality of the silence between them was different now. Not the silence of two strangers cohabiting a house. Something with more texture than that. Word traveled quickly in Yorkshire. By the following morning, the dinner had been thoroughly processed through every drawing room and parlor that had a connection to any of the 22 people who had attended, and the account that emerged from that processing was from Eleanor's perspective both accurate and irrelevant, though from Edward's perspective it was neither. What Yorkshire society had concluded in aggregate was this: the Duke of Ashcombe had married a woman who was not what she appeared. The bankrupt Earl's daughter spoke 4 languages fluently and had demonstrated in the course of a single dinner a command of European economics and railway finance that had discomfited at least one baron, one baronet, and one lord, who each separately believed this to be exclusively their domain. Lord Frederick Vale had, it was reported, said very little on the carriage ride home. Lady Margaret had said rather more, but what she had said by multiple accounts was not dismissive. It was something closer to cautious reassessment, which for Lady Margaret represented a significant movement of position. Sir William Graves had sent a note. It arrived on the morning of the 3rd day after the dinner addressed to Eleanor, which was unusual in itself, as notes of this nature were conventionally addressed to the Duke, and it requested with the formal politeness of a man who is making a request. He considers important, and is therefore applying extra care to the language, a private audience at her earliest convenience, to discuss the Northern Rail corridor and the projected return calculations she had mentioned at dinner. Eleanor showed Edward the note across the breakfast table. He read it. Sir William's estate is positioned along the secondary corridor, he said, setting it down. I know. His cooperation with the Harrington Line access could cut 6 months off the approval process. He looked at her. You understand the approval process? I read the parliamentary file. Mrs. Calloway retrieved it from the records room. Edward sat back in his chair. He studied the ceiling for a moment in the manner of a man who is reconsidering multiple things simultaneously and requires a brief pause to manage the volume of revision required. You intend to meet with him? I thought I would ask you first. A pause. But yes, I think it would be useful. High-mada decision. Then he was aware of making it aware of the particular quality of the moment, the way it required him to move against the grain of every instinct that had been cultivated in him across 36 years of being a Harrington Duke, in a world that had very clear ideas about what dukes decided and who they consulted. Meet with him, Edward said. I will ask Hartley to prepare the corridor documents for your review before the meeting. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. You trust my reading of them? He did not answer immediately. He let the question sit, not because he was uncertain, but because the honest answer required him to walk through it carefully, and he had not yet decided how much honesty this particular morning could sustain. I trust, he said finally, that you have read more documents in the last 3 weeks than most men I know have read in 3 years, and that you retain what you read and apply it, without requiring the assistance of someone else to tell you what it means. Yes, I trust your reading of them." Eleanor looked at him. He could not read her expression entirely. There was something in it he did not have a name for, yet something that required more time and more information than 6 weeks of careful distance had allowed him to accumulate. She nodded once. "Thank you," she said. The meeting with Sir William took place on the following Tuesday in the Ashcombe Library, with Hartley present for the documentation, and Edward present, because he had decided without explaining the decision to anyone including himself, that he wished to be there. Sir William was 54, experienced and accustomed to running his own meetings. He arrived with 2 of his men both carrying documents, and he greeted Eleanor with the particular combination of courtesy and barely concealed curiosity that she had by now learned to identify as the default mode of men who had revised their expectations of her, but were still in the process of accommodating the revision. He spread his maps on the table. He began to explain the problem with the secondary corridor alignment as he understood it. Eleanor let him finish. She waded through the entirety of his explanation, which was competent, but which rested on a set of baseline assumptions about the terrain gradient that Eleanor had already identified as incorrect from the survey data, and then she said, "The gradient calculation in Section 4 is based on the 1879 survey. There was a subsequent survey in 1882 that revised the eastern elevation by 11 feet. The difference is material to the drainage requirements and therefore to the cost projection." Sir William's lead man looked at Sir William. Sir William looked at Eleanor. "You have the 1882 survey. I have the summary data. Hartley can retrieve the full document." Hartley retrieved it. Sir William's lead man went through it with the focused attention of someone who had just discovered a significant error in work he had stood behind for 3 years. The number he arrived at when the revised calculation was applied to the drainage cost was different from the number Sir William had been working from by a margin that made Sir William press 2 fingers to his temple and breathe slowly through his nose. "This changes the projected return," Sir William said. "By roughly 12%, yes," Eleanor said. "Which means the corridor remains viable, but the approval argument needs to be reframed. The parliamentary case cannot rely on the current cost projection. It needs to lead with the strategic advantage to northern commerce rather than the immediate return figure." "And you have a suggested framing?" "I have 3, Eleanor said. "I can outline them now, or I can prepare a written summary if you prefer to review before we continue." Sir William looked at Edward, who had said nothing for the last 20 minutes, and who was by that point leaning slightly forward with his arms on the table, in the manner of a man who has lost the thread of his role in the proceedings, and is not entirely displeased about it. "Written summary," Sir William said. Then after a beat, "And perhaps the outline as well. Now if you're willing." She outlined all 3. By the time the meeting concluded, Sir William had committed to a preliminary agreement on corridor access that Edward had been attempting to negotiate through Hartley for the better part of 4 months. When Sir William's carriage had gone, Hartley collected his documents with the careful, neutral efficiency of a man who has witnessed something significant and is processing it at a respectful distance. He excused himself from the library. Edward and Eleanor were left alone at the table with the maps still spread between them. He looked at the maps. He looked at her. 4 months, he said. The framing was wrong, she answered. Men in Sir William's position respond better to strategic argument than financial argument when the relationship with a neighboring estate is at stake. The financial case reads as pressure. The strategic case reads as partnership. How did you know that about him? I asked Mrs. Calloway about his family history with the neighboring estates, Eleanor said. And I read 3 years of his parliamentary correspondence in the file room. Edward was quiet for a long time. What he felt in that moment was not a simple thing. It contained in proportions he could not immediately separate something that was gratitude, something that was admiration, and something that was the particular acute discomfort of a man who has understood that his life has been operating at a significant deficit without his knowledge. Eleanor, he said. The name plain without the title. He had not used it before, had addressed her as Your Grace, or not addressed her directly, at all the formal distance of two people conducting a transaction. Her name felt different in his mouth than he had expected. More specific, more consequential. She looked at him. "I have been conducting this marriage," he said, "as though it were an arrangement that required my administration and your compliance." She did not deny it. "I am aware," she said carefully, "that you are reconsidering something." "I am reconsidering several things." "Yes," Eleanor said. "I can see that." She began to gather the papers on her side of the table, not to leave, but with the practical efficiency of a woman who does not leave work in disarray. She stacked them neatly. She aligned the corners. He watched her hands. "The contractor agreements," he said. "I would like your assessment before Friday's meeting, a written one if you're willing to spend the time. I will have it ready by Thursday. And the corridor documents, I would like you to continue with those." She looked up. "That is Hartley's work." "Hartley is good," Edward said. "You are better." The silence that followed was not empty. It was the silence of a woman who has spent years in rooms where the acknowledgement of her competence required the additional labor of pretending she had not heard it correctly, who has learned by necessity to treat recognition with care because recognition too quickly trusted becomes recognition too easily withdrawn. She looked at him steadily. "I will not do it," she said, "if it is to be undone at the first meeting where your colleagues find my presence inconvenient. It will not be undone." "You are certain of that?" "I am not certain of very many things," Edward said. "I have spent the last 3 days discovering the precise extent of what I was not certain of. But I am certain of that." Eleanor studied him for a moment, that same measuring look, the one that took the full weight of a thing before she moved. Then she nodded. "Thursday," she said. "I'll have it ready." She left the library. Edward sat alone at the long table with the maps of the northern corridor spread between his hands, and the windows showed the late afternoon going gray and still above the grounds, and he sat there and thought about what 4 months of the wrong framing cost a man. He thought about what 6 weeks of the wrong assumptions cost a marriage. I thought about Eleanor's hands aligning the edges of the papers precise and unhurried, the same hands that had traced the fault in the bridge drawings and held 3 decades of her mother's German letters in a box she had carried herself out of Whitmore Valley. He pulled the nearest map toward him and looked at it. He was going to need to relearn a great deal. He found with a clarity that surprised him that he did not mind. The Thursday report arrived on Edward's desk at 7 in the morning, before he had finished his first cup of coffee. It was 41 pages. He had asked for an assessment of 3 contractor agreements. Eleanor had delivered an assessment of 3 contractor agreements, a cross-referenced analysis of 7 related procurement decisions made over the preceding 2 years, a summary of the cumulative financial exposure those decisions had created for the Ashcombe estate, and a single-page closing memorandum that organized the corrective actions in order of urgency, with estimated cost recovery figures attached to each. He read all 41 pages before breakfast. Then he read the closing memorandum again. The number in the top right corner of the final page. The aggregate figure representing what the estate had overpaid across the 7 procurement decisions was large enough that Edward sat very still for approximately 30 seconds after he encountered it, his coffee going cold beside him, doing the kind of arithmetic that a man does when he is trying to determine whether he has misread something, and gradually understanding that he has not. He had not misread it. He had simply not read it before, because no one had told him to look, and he had not thought to ask. He brought the report to the Friday meeting. Hartley arrived first, carrying his own documents, and took his customary seat at the end of the table where he could manage the papers efficiently. The 2 contractors arrived together, Pemberton, who handled the construction projects, and a newer man named Doyle, who had come on for the road resurfacing work 6 months prior. Both men were competent and self-assured in the manner of tradesmen who have long-standing relationships with large estates, and understand that long-standing relationships create a particular kind of latitude. Eleanor entered last. Both contractors looked at her with the same expression, polite, professionally neutral, and carrying beneath the neutrality the specific quality of men who have been told to expect something unusual and have not yet determined how to categorize it. Pemberton pulled out his chair. He was 50 broad with a gray beard trimmed close, and the careful manner of a man who navigated aristocratic clients by reading their preferences in advance. "Your Grace," Pemberton said, addressing Edward. "A pleasure as always." He nodded at Eleanor in the general direction of courtesy, and then returned his attention to the Duke, which was from his perspective where attention belonged. Eleanor opened her folder and did not react to this. Edward let the opening pleasantries complete their course, then set the 41-page report in the center of the table. "Gentlemen," he said, "I would like to begin with the Eastern Drainage Contract." Pemberton nodded, reached for his own copy of the relevant document. "Before we go to your version," Edward continued, "I would like you to hear my wife's reading of the cost overrun clause in Section 9. The quality of the silence that followed was different from the silence that had attended Eleanor's German at the dinner table. That silence had been social, the compressed reaction of people recalibrating an interpersonal situation. This silence was professional, harder-edged, carrying the specific weight of men who conduct their livelihoods in a particular territory and have just registered that the territory may be contested. Pemberton's expression did not change, but something behind it shifted. Eleanor did not wait for the shift to resolve itself. "Section 9, subsection 3, she said, turning to the page with the economy of someone who has been here before in her mind many times already. The clause reads, "Cost overruns, attributable to unforeseen site conditions, shall be borne by the estate at the prevailing day rate, subject to contractor certification of cause." In the 3 instances where this clause was invoked over the past 18 months, the certification of cause was provided by the contractor's own site manager without independent verification from the estate. Pemberton said nothing. "In the first instance," Eleanor continued, "the unforeseen site condition cited was groundwater variance. The groundwater data for that section of the estate is recorded in the Geological Survey of 1878 and shows no variance from the conditions at contract signing. In the second instance, Your Grace." Pemberton's voice had taken on a new quality, still professional, but with a careful precision that had not been there a moment before. "These are technical matters that require some context to interpret accurately." "I have the context," Eleanor said. "In the second instance, the unforeseen condition cited was timber grade variance attributed to supply chain disruption. I cross-referenced the supply chain documentation against the current market records for the period. The grade variance cited would have reduced material cost to the contractor by approximately 14%. The variance was not unforeseen. It was advantageous." Pemberton set down his pen. The other contractor, Doyle, had stopped pretending to look at his own papers and was watching Eleanor with the expression of a man who is rapidly reconsidering a room he thought he understood. Hartley was making notes. Edward said nothing. He had read the report. He knew what was coming. He sat at the head of the table with his hands flat on the surface and let his wife work. "In the third instance," Eleanor said, "the certification was provided and the cause appears legitimate. I am not suggesting fraud in all 3 cases. I am suggesting that the certification process as currently structured does not provide sufficient protection for the estate. The clause needs revision before any new contracts are signed, and the 2 disputed overruns should be reviewed by an independent assessor before final settlement." Pemberton looked at Edward. Edward looked back at him. "The clause will be revised," Edward said. "My wife will provide the revised language. The 2 disputed overruns are suspended pending independent assessment. Hartley will arrange for the assessor." Pemberton was a professional. He had navigated difficult moments before, and he navigated this one with the contained, careful composure of a man who has understood that the landscape has changed and is making rapid adjustments to his position within it. "Of course, Your Grace," Pemberton said. "If there are concerns about the process, I welcome the review." He looked at Eleanor when he said it, not dismissively, not with hostility, but with the direct, recalibrated attention of a man who has concluded that dismissiveness and hostility are no longer available options and has not yet determined what the appropriate alternative is. Eleanor met his look. "Thank you, Mr. Pemberton," she said. "I have no interest in damaging a productive working relationship. I have an interest in ensuring the terms of that relationship are accurate." The meeting continued for another hour. It was by the end thoroughly different from any contractor meeting that had been held in that room under Edward Harrington's management. Not because Eleanor dominated it, but because her presence changed the nature of the conversation in ways that could not be reversed once they had begun. Questions were answered more completely. Numbers were explained rather than presented. The careful, practiced shorthand of a contractor who assumes client unfamiliarity with detail was replaced gradually and somewhat uneasily by the more precise language of people who know they are being followed closely. When Pemberton and Doyle left, Hartley gathered his notes, and there was a moment before he followed the contractors out, during which he paused near the door and looked back at Edward. "The 1882 survey document, Your Grace," Hartley said. "I should have caught the variance. I didn't." "No," Edward agreed. "I'll institute a cross-reference procedure for future contract assessments." "Good." Edward looked at Eleanor. "Work with my wife on the structure. She has thought about this more recently than either of us." Hartley nodded at Eleanor with the unambiguous respect of a competent man who has encountered someone more competent and sees no reason to make more of it than that. "Whenever suits you, Your Grace," he said, and he meant it for Eleanor, and they both understood that. He left. The door closed. Edward and Eleanor sat on opposite sides of the table with the debris of the meeting between them. Folders, maps, the 41-page report with Edward's annotations in the margins. The revised contract language Eleanor had already drafted, and which Pemberton had taken away with the expression of a man carrying something he needed to study privately before responding to. Edward looked at the report. 14%, he said. "Approximately. It could be slightly higher. I'd need the full supply chain documentation to give you a precise figure." "How much across all 7 procurement decisions?" Eleanor looked at the closing memorandum. She told him the figure. It was the same figure he had sat with for 30 seconds that morning. Hearing it said aloud in Eleanor's precise, unhurried voice made it no smaller. "That is 3 years of the Southfield's total yield," he said. "Yes." A pause. "I know." He stood up and walked to the window. He stood there with his back to her and breathed for a moment. "I need to understand," he said, "how this was not visible to me." "You were not looking at procurement," Eleanor said. "You were looking at the large numbers, the railway contracts, the mineral rights, the corridor negotiation. The procurement decisions are small individually. The overruns are individually defensible. The pattern only becomes visible when you look at all of them together over a sufficient time period." "And you looked." "I had time," she said simply. "And the file room was thorough." He turned from the window. She was watching him, not with satisfaction, not with the particular contained triumph he might have feared from a woman who had just demonstrated in a room full of skeptical men that she knew the contents of the estate better than its owner. She was watching him the way she watched everything, with that particular quality of attention that saw things clearly and did not require them to be different from what they were. "The people who are coming to the Yorkshire Assembly next month," he said. It was not a question he had planned. It arrived because he was thinking, and when Edward thought he spoke a habit he had largely suppressed in the presence of others, but was apparently suspending now. "Frederick will be there." Eleanor's expression did not change. "I assumed as much." "He will not have forgotten the dinner." "Men like Frederick do not forget." She gathered her papers. "They reorganize." "What does that mean?" "It means," Eleanor said, setting a folder at a precise angle, "that the public embarrassment of the dinner is now filed as a debt. He will look for an opportunity to collect it in a context where I have less advantage. A room with different rules than a dinner table." Edward considered this. "The Assembly is that room," he said. "Potentially, yes." He looked at her. "Are you concerned?" Eleanor looked up from her papers. "I am never," she said carefully, "unconcerned about Frederick Vale, in a room with rules he understands better than I do." The Yorkshire Assembly met on the last Thursday of every month in the main hall of the Cavendish Building, in the centre of Harrogate. It was not a formal parliamentary proceeding, but it functioned as one in every way that mattered, a gathering of the major landowners and financial interests in the county, nominally for the purpose of coordinating regional affairs, practically for the purpose of determining who held influence over what, and making sure everyone in the room understood the current arrangement. Edward had attended for 13 years. He knew the room's dynamics with the precision of a man who had navigated them long enough to understand where the actual power sat, which was rarely where the formal seating suggested. He had never brought Eleanor. He brought Eleanor. He told her 3 days before the meeting, and she received the information with the same composed attention she applied to everything. Asked 2 practical questions about the agenda and the attendees, and then went to the file room and read 3 years of assembly minutes. She read them all. She arrived at the Cavendish building, wearing the same midnight blue gown she had worn to the dinner, which Edward suspected was not an accident, and she walked into a room that held 47 men who had in various configurations over the preceding month received and processed accounts of the dinner at Harrington Hall. The room's reaction to her entrance was not the reaction of people encountering an unknown quantity. It was the reaction of people encountering a quantity they had heard described and were now calibrating the description against the reality. Some of them had been at the dinner. They straightened almost imperceptibly. Some of them had not been there but had heard enough that their expressions carried a preemptive caution. Lord Frederick Vale had been there. He was standing near the east side of the room, with 2 men whose names Eleanor knew from the assembly minutes. Lord Harland, who chaired the Regional Rail Committee, and a man named Cresswell, who handled the parliamentary liaison work for the northern counties. Frederick watched Eleanor enter. His expression was composed, courteous even. But his eyes had the particular quality of a man who has prepared something and is waiting for the right moment to deploy it. She had been right. He had reorganized. The assembly proceeded through its first 3 agenda items without incident. A drainage dispute between 2 neighboring estates. A question about road maintenance funding. A report on the harvest yield for the Southern District. Eleanor sat beside Edward and listened, and took occasional notes in the small notebook she had brought, and the men on either side of her gradually stopped being aware of her as an anomaly, and began to be aware of her as a presence, which was a different thing entirely. The 4th agenda item was the Northern Rail Corridor. Lord Harland, as chair of the Rail Committee, introduced it. He summarized the current status of the parliamentary approval process, outlined the projected timeline, and presented the cost figures that his committee had been working from. They were the wrong figures. Eleanor recognized them immediately. They were based on the 1879 survey, the same baseline that Sir William Graves had been using before she corrected it, which meant the parliamentary framing was built on a cost projection that was 12% higher than the accurate figure. She wrote a number in her notebook and pushed it slightly toward Edward. He looked at it. He looked at her. The question in his eyes was quick, asking without words whether she was certain. She was certain. He waited until Harland had finished his summary. Then he said, "My lord, the cost projection in Section 3 requires a revision. The figure is based on the 1879 Geological Survey. The 1882 survey revised the eastern elevation and changes the drainage requirement." Harland looked up. "The 1879 survey is the basis of record for the committee, Your Grace." "It is superseded by the 1882 document," Edward said. "The correct figure is approximately 12% lower." The room's attention had sharpened. 47 men who had been in various degrees of engagement with the agenda item were now paying close attention to this exchange. Frederick Vale, from his position near the east wall, said, "Perhaps Your Grace would share the source of this revised figure." There it was. Not aggressive, carefully calibrated to be polite to read, as reasonable to invite the answer that Frederick was Eleanor understood immediately counting on. Because the source of the revised figure was Eleanor. And Frederick had calculated that Edward in this room would either have to claim it as his own work, which the 41-page report and Sir William's meeting would eventually contradict, or attribute it to his wife, which Frederick believed would discredit it. He had set a trap with 2 exits, both of which he had decided led to the same place. Edward looked at Frederick. Then he looked at Eleanor. She gave him nothing. No signal, no instruction, no indication of what she thought he ought to do. She looked at him with the same clear level attention she had given him across the breakfast table the morning he had asked how she learned German, and she waited. He made his decision. "The source," Edward said, "is the Duchess of Ashcombe, who identified the discrepancy in the baseline data during her review of the corridor documents last week. She also coordinated the preliminary access agreement with Sir William Graves on the secondary corridor." He looked at Frederick directly. You are welcome to verify either point with Sir William directly, my lord. I understand he is expected this afternoon. Frederick did not react immediately. He was a man who had spent 40 years in rooms like this one, and he had the skill of the experienced political animal, which is the ability to absorb a setback without broadcasting the fact. But the room had heard it. 47 men had heard the Duke of Ashcombe attribute a material correction to the Yorkshire Rail Committee's core financial data to his wife, with Sir William Graves cited as corroboration. Sir William's name carried specific weight. He was not a man known for endorsing things he had not personally verified. Lord Cavendish, seated 3 rows forward, turned around. "The 1882 survey," Cavendish said, addressing Eleanor directly. "What is the revised drainage cost figure for the full corridor?" Eleanor told him. She gave him the precise number, the methodology, and the material difference it made to the parliamentary submission timeline. Cavendish nodded slowly. "That changes the submission argument," he said. "Yes," Eleanor said. "The current argument leads with cost efficiency and relies on figures that can be challenged. The revised argument should lead with strategic necessity for northern commerce and use the corrected figures as supporting evidence rather than the primary case. It is harder to challenge a strategic argument than a financial one. Because the strategic case is qualitative," Cavendish said, "and because the financial case with the correct figures actually becomes stronger when it is presented as supporting data rather than the headline number." The committee's previous framing was inadvertently underselling the corridor. Cavendish turned back to face the front of the room. He said to the table at large, "I move that the committee adopt the revised baseline and reformulate the parliamentary submission according to the strategic framework the Duchess of Ashcombe has outlined." The motion required a second. It received 4 nearly simultaneously from different parts of the room. Frederick Vale did not move and did not speak. The vote was conducted. The motion carried. Lord Harland, with the professional equanimity of a man who understands that the correct course is to incorporate a better analysis when one becomes available, regardless of its source, announced that the committee would revise its documents accordingly, and requested that the Duchess of Ashcombe provide a written summary of the corrected framework for distribution. The meeting moved to the 5th agenda item. In the movement of the room, the shuffle of papers, the murmur of resumed side conversations, the ordinary mechanics of 47 people transitioning between topics. Frederick Vale crossed the room. He stopped beside Edward first. Briefly, with the formal courtesy of a man who is managing something carefully. "Your Grace." He said nothing else to Edward. Then he looked at Eleanor. She looked back at him. "Your Grace," Frederick said. The title applied to her now with the particular deliberate quality of a man choosing each word with awareness of its history. "My lord," Eleanor said. The pause between them was not long. It contained in its brevity the entire compressed weight of the dinner table. The German she had understood, the answer she had given, and the month of reorganization that had followed. "The 1882 survey," Frederick said. "Where did you locate it?" "It is not in the standard county record." "It is in the Ashcombe file room," Eleanor said. "Filed under geological assessments, cross-reference to the railway development section. It was misfiled originally under drainage rather than survey. Mrs. Calloway found it when I described what I was looking for." A pause. "You knew it existed." "I knew something should exist," Eleanor said. "The 1879 figures had internal inconsistencies that suggested a subsequent assessment had been made. I looked until I found confirmation." Frederick was quiet for a moment. What happened next was not what Eleanor had expected, and she would think about it afterward in the carriage home with the particular attention she gave to things that required recalibration. Frederick Vale said, "You would have been useful on the committee." He said it without warmth, but also without irony. He said it the way a chess player after a very long game tells the opponent that the match was worth the time, not friendly, but genuine. He walked away before she could answer. Edward watched him go. "That," Edward said quietly, "is the closest thing to an apology you will receive from Frederick Vale." "I know," Eleanor said. "It is sufficient." The carriage home took 40 minutes. Eleanor spent most of them looking out the window at the darkening landscape and thinking, processing in the particular systematic way she processed everything, what had happened in that room, and what it meant for what came next. Edward spent those 40 minutes watching her, not with the cataloging attention he had applied in the early weeks, the assessment of an acquisition, with the focused, uncertain attention of a man who is learning something and knows he is still in the early stages of learning it, who understands that the full scope of what he does not know is considerably larger than what he has discovered, and that the discovery is ongoing. "The motion carried," he said at some point in the middle of the journey. Eleanor turned from the window. "Yes." Cavendish moved it without prompting. He paused. "He spoke to you as though he expected you to know what you were talking about." "Lord Cavendish is 72 years old," Eleanor said. "He has spent 50 of those years watching people underestimate the wrong person. I think he recognized something." "What?" She looked at him across the carriage. "A pattern," she said. "He's seen it before, so have I. The question is always whether the person in the room who understands what is actually happening has the position to do something about it." Edward held her look. "And tonight you had the position." "Tonight," Eleanor said carefully, "you gave it to me. The distinction mattered." She said it without sentiment, without the soft framing that would have made it easier for him to receive as a compliment to himself. She said it accurately because it was accurate. He had chosen to attribute the work to her in a room where he could have taken it for himself, and that choice was his, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. He had given it to her, and she had used it. "It will not be the last time," he said. Eleanor looked at him. "No," she said, "it will not." The carriage rolled on through the dark, and the distance between them was the same distance it had been the width of a carriage seat, the width of 6 weeks of careful contractual distance, and it was not the same distance at all. Something was building between them that neither had planned for, and both of them in their separate silences knew it. Frederick's words were still in Eleanor's mind when she finally moved to respond to them, the words he had spoken, and the ones beneath them, the ones that said without saying, "I was wrong about you." She had not needed his acknowledgement. She had not worked toward it. But sitting in the carriage with Edward's eyes on her face and the Yorkshire night moving past them both, she thought about what it meant that the acknowledgement had come anyway, unsolicited, unperformed, accurate. It meant that the acknowledgement had come anyway, unsolicited, unperformed, accurate. Facts she had once told a roomful of people were kinder than rumors. She had not known when she said it that the same was true in reverse, that the fact of her competence applied consistently and without apology was a kinder correction than any argument she might have made. She was beginning to understand what kind of room she was in. Not the rooms of Yorkshire, not the assembly, or the dinner table, or the contractor meeting. The room of this marriage. The room she and Edward were still slowly and with some difficulty learning to share. The carriage turned through the gates of Ashcombe. The house was lit in the distance, warm against the dark. She thought, "This is mine." Not the way the land was technically hers, not the legal contractual ledger entry mine. Something more complicated than that, more specific. The work was hers. The 41 pages. The corridor framework. The room full of men who had voted to use her analysis. The man beside her who was looking at her like he was still reading something he had not yet reached the end of. She thought, "This is mine." And for the first time since the carriage from Whitmore Valley had pulled through these same gates 6 weeks before Eleanor Harrington believed it. The written summary. Eleanor had promised. Lord Harland arrived at the Cavendish building 2 days after the assembly, and by the end of that week it had been read by every member of the rail committee and forwarded without attribution discussion, but with unanimous approval to the Parliamentary Liaison Office in London. Cresswell, the liaison man, sent a note back to Harland that contained one sentence of particular interest. The revised framework was the strongest submission the Northern Corridor project had produced in 4 years of attempting to secure approval. Harland forwarded the note to Edward. Edward read it at breakfast and passed it across the table to Eleanor without comment. She read it. She set it down. She returned to her tea. "Cresswell will want to meet," she said. "He already does. His follow-up letter arrived yesterday. He is proposing a London meeting in the 3rd week of November." Eleanor looked up. "London?" "Yes." Edward held her gaze. "I would like you to come." The word, like carried weight, he had not previously put into it. Not, "I require your presence," not "the estate's interests are best served by," not the practical formulations he had been deploying for weeks as a way of requesting Eleanor's involvement, while maintaining the fiction that the requests were primarily administrative. He had said, "I would like." It was personal. They both heard it. Eleanor set her teacup down carefully. "I will need 3 days to prepare the supplementary documents." "You have 10, Edward said. "The meeting is the 17th. She nodded. That was all just the nod, the practical acceptance of a practical arrangement. But Edward noticed that she did not immediately return to her letter the way she usually did when a conversation had reached its functional conclusion. She stayed with it for a moment, and whatever she was thinking, she kept behind her eyes, and he had learned enough in the past weeks to understand that he could ask, and she would answer him plainly, or he could wait, and she would tell him when she was ready. He waited. Edward. She used his name the way he had used hers that day in the library without the title, which in this house meant something specific, a small and deliberate lowering of the formal distance between them. What is this becoming? He did not pretend not to understand the question. "I don't know precisely," he said. "I know what it was. I am less certain what it is now." She looked at him with the clear, undeflected gaze that had over weeks stopped unsettling him and started feeling like the most honest thing in the room. "That is not nothing," she said. "No," he agreed. "It is not nothing." She picked up her letter. He picked up his coffee. The morning continued. But something had been said that had not been said before, and they both knew it, and the knowing of it sat between them like a new piece of furniture in a room they were still learning to move around in. The weeks between the assembly and the London meeting were the most productive of Edward's professional life, and he recognized this fact with the particular discomfort of a man who understands that the productivity is not entirely his own doing. Eleanor worked with Hartley on the cross-reference procedure for contract assessments, and within a fortnight, it had been implemented across all active procurement files. The independent assessor's report on the 2 disputed overruns came back in the second week. Her figures had been accurate within 2 percentage points, and Pemberton settled both claims without contest, which Hartley reported with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has resolved something he had allowed to persist too long. She met twice more with Sir William Graves, once at Ashcombe and once at his estate. Edward attended neither meeting. Not because Eleanor had excluded him, she had not, but because he had understood without needing to be told that Sir William's cooperation had been secured through Eleanor's particular combination of accuracy and respect for his intelligence, and that his own presence at subsequent meetings would shift the dynamic in a way that would not serve the outcome. He had sent her instead. He had sent her, and he had waited, and she had come back with the corridor access terms finalized and a side agreement about drainage maintenance that benefited both estates, which she presented to him with the same matter-of-fact delivery she used for everything, and which he received with the growing complicated awareness that he was watching someone operate at the full extent of their capability, and that the full extent was very considerable indeed. I thought about this often. He thought about it in the way he thought about things that required reckoning, not with pleasure, not with dread, but with the clear-eyed seriousness of a man who is examining a balance sheet and finding the accounting on one side substantially heavier than he had previously entered it. He had been wrong about Eleanor Whitmore in ways that were not merely errors of information, but errors of fundamental assumption. The kind of errors that, once identified, require a man to look at not just the specific mistake, but the reasoning that produced it. He had assumed, because of how she had come to him through a land agreement, through necessity, through the practical arithmetic of her family's financial failure, that the quality of her mind and the extent of her competence were constrained by those circumstances defined by them. He had looked at the packaging of the transaction and concluded something about the contents. He had been in 36 years of managing large and complex interests more wrong about fewer things. He was having trouble identifying a comparable error. It was Hartley who said it out loud, though he said it in the careful, indirect way of a loyal man who understands the boundaries of his position. He said it on a Wednesday afternoon in the 3rd week of October, when Edward had come to the estate office to review the updated corridor documents before they went to London. Hartley had the papers organized, the relevant sections flagged, the discrepancies he wanted Edward to note clearly marked. Edward worked through them. He was about to sign the cover document when Hartley said, "Your Grace, if I may." Edward looked up. "The Countess of Harrington, your mother reviewed the estate accounts herself, in her time." Edward set down his pen. Hartley did not elaborate. He simply looked at the table with the expression of a man who has said what he came to say and considers his obligation met. "I know," Edward said. "She was not consulted on the contractor agreements either." Hartley paused. "It was in retrospect a gap in the process." "Yes." Edward picked up the pen again. "It was." He signed the document. Hartley gathered his papers and left, and Edward sat with the knowledge he had just been handed gently by a loyal man in the only language available to them, and he sat with it and let it be what it was. His mother had managed the Harrington estate's household accounts and domestic procurement for 22 years of marriage to his father, and his father had thanked her at public dinners and ignored her at private ones, and Edward had grown up watching this and had absorbed from it, without ever consciously articulating the absorption, a set of convictions about what women managed and what men decided, and where those categories intersected, which was nowhere. He had carried those convictions into his own marriage without examining them. He had offered Eleanor the title and the house, and the adequate distant courtesy of a man meeting his contractual obligations, and he had called it a fair arrangement, and it had taken 41 pages, and a Yorkshire assembly, and a contractor meeting, and 4 months of railway negotiations to begin to show him what a fair arrangement actually required. He went to find Eleanor. She was in the library. She was frequently in the library. In the late afternoon reading, which was a fact he had known in the abstract, and had never translated into the specific action of going to find her there. He had not before the dinner sought her out for anything that was not administrative. He opened the library door. She was seated near the window, a book in her lap, her reading posture, the same slightly forward lean she brought to documents and letters and everything else. She read as though she was moving toward the material rather than receiving it. She looked up when he entered. He crossed the room and sat in the chair nearest her, which was not his customary chair. He had a chair in this library, a larger one near the desk, but the distance from his customary chair to where she was sitting was too large for what he needed to say. "I owe you an apology," he said. Eleanor put a finger in her book to mark the page. She waited. "Not for any single thing," he said. "For an assumption I made before I had any right to make it and maintained after I had sufficient evidence to revise it, because revising it required me to admit something about my own judgment that was uncomfortable." She was very still. "I decided what you were," he said. "Before I spoke to you almost. I reviewed the terms of the Whitmore arrangement, and I appended to those terms a complete set of conclusions about your competence and your character and what you were capable of, and I proceeded on those conclusions without once asking whether they were accurate." Eleanor said nothing. "The bridge," he said. "I told myself you were fortunate. The dinner I sat at the end of that table and watched 22 people revise their understanding of my wife in real time. And I told myself I had simply not had occasion to observe what I already knew. I did not once in that entire evening ask myself what else I had missed." He stopped. The library was very quiet. "You did not ask," Eleanor said finally, "because the version you had of me was sufficient for what you needed, and you had not yet decided that you needed more than that. That is a more charitable interpretation than mine." "It is not more charitable. It is more accurate." She looked at him directly. "You are a man who operates on information. When the information is sufficient, you do not seek additional data. I was providing what the arrangement required. You had no reason to look further." "I had every reason," Edward said. "I simply did not take it." She held his look. "No," she said quietly. "You did not." It was the first time she had agreed with his self-indictment rather than reframing it, and the absence of the reframe had more weight than anything she could have said with greater elaboration. She let it stand plain and honest, and a little hard, the way she let everything stand. He said, "I am sorry, Eleanor." She took a slow breath. "I know," she said. And then after a pause that he did not rush, "I believe you." It was not absolution. He had not expected absolution and would not have trusted it if it had come quickly from a woman who held every position she took with both hands and did not release them without examination. What she had given him was something more solid than absolution. She had given him her belief, which was a thing she did not distribute loosely, and he knew it, and he received it accordingly. He sat with her in the library for the next hour, not working, not reviewing documents. He asked her about the book she was reading, a French history of the Venetian trade empire, which she had apparently been working through for the past 2 weeks, and she told him about it with the natural enthusiasm of a person who has found something genuinely interesting and does not see any reason to pretend otherwise. And he listened and asked questions, and she answered them. And outside the library, the afternoon went on without them. It was the first hour in 8 weeks of marriage that had belonged to nothing but themselves. He did not want it to end. He noticed this with the precise awareness of a man who is not accustomed to feeling things he is not prepared for, and he let the noticing happen without filing it for once in a drawer. The London meeting was on a Tuesday. They took the early train from Harrogate, arriving at King's Cross at 10:30. Edward had reserved rooms at his usual London residence, the Harrington townhouse in Belgrave Square, which had been maintained by a skeleton staff in his absence, and which opened around them with the particular attentive precision of a house that has been waiting. Eleanor moved through it with the same composed attention she brought to everything new-looking, without being observed, to look cataloguing in the quiet way she had. "You have not been to London recently," Edward said. "Not since I was 17. She turned slightly from examining the drawing-room wall. "My father brought me for a season that we could not afford. He believed it was important for me to understand what I was preparing for." "And did you?" "I understood London perfectly well." A pause. "I was less prepared for what came after." He did not ask what she meant. He knew what she meant. Whitmore Valley. The accumulating debt, the years of managing something that was coming apart with insufficient tools and insufficient support, and no one to tell who was listening. "You are prepared now," he said. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "I am." The meeting with Cresswell took place at the Parliamentary Liaison Offices in Whitehall, in a room that smelled of old paper and institutional certainty, populated by 5 men who had spent collective decades managing the intersection of aristocratic interest and parliamentary procedure, and who received Eleanor's presence with the range of reactions that had become by now familiar to her. Cautious courtesy, professional neutrality, and the particular stillness of men deciding in real time which category to put her in. Cresswell himself was 60 gray and efficient in the manner of a man who has outlasted 12 ministers and 3 governments by being the person who actually understood the files. He shook Edward's hand. He shook Eleanor's hand. He did not treat these as different actions. He said, "The framework submission is the best the Northern Corridor Committee has produced. I want to understand its construction before I present it to the minister." He looked at Eleanor when he said it, not at Edward. Eleanor opened her document case. What followed was 3 hours of the most technically detailed conversation Edward had observed Eleanor conduct, and he had by that point observed her conduct several that had redefined his understanding of technical detail. She walked Cresswell through the revised baseline, the strategic framing, the 3 alternative argument structures she had prepared, and her reasoning for recommending the primary one. She answered his questions with the specific accuracy that Cresswell, who had spent 30 years parsing imprecise answers from people who did not want to be caught, not knowing something visibly appreciated. At one point, one of Cresswell's junior colleagues, a young man perhaps 25 with the particular brand of confidence that came from a good education and insufficient experience, asked a question that rested on a flawed assumption about parliamentary committee procedure. Eleanor corrected the assumption. She did it briefly without emphasis, returning immediately to the substantive point. The young man flushed slightly and made a note. Cresswell watched this exchange with the expression of a man who has seen what he needed to see. When the meeting ended, he walked them to the building entrance. At the door, he shook Edward's hand again. Then he turned to Eleanor. "Your Grace," Cresswell said, "I have been managing the Northern Corridor submission for 4 years. In that time I have met with the Duke of Ashcombe twice, the Rail Committee 6 times, and Sir William Graves 3 times. None of those meetings produced what this one has." Eleanor looked at him steadily. "The analysis was available," she said. "It required someone to look for the 1882 survey. Several people should have looked for it, Cresswell said. None of them did. He paused. I will be recommending the framework to the minister by the end of the month. I anticipate approval of the preliminary submission by spring. 4 years. The corridor had been in the approval process for 4 years. Spring was 5 months away. She held Cresswell's look. Thank you, she said. Thank you, he replied, and he meant it specifically and without ambiguity, and then he went back inside, and Eleanor and Edward stood on the Whitehall pavement in the October air. Edward did not speak immediately. He looked at the building. He looked at her. 4 years, he said. The framing was wrong, Eleanor said. And the data was wrong. Both problems had the same solution. You. She turned to look at him, with the level, clear attention that he had long since stopped finding impersonal, and now understood as the most personal thing about her. The direct, unflinching quality of a woman who looked at things as they actually were, including him. The information existed, she said. Someone needed to put it together. Someone with access to the file room and the geological surveys and 3 years of assembly minutes, and your contractor's procurement agreements, she added with a precision that was, he thought, entirely deliberate. He looked at her. And then he did something he had not done in the 8 weeks of this marriage, something he had not planned, something that arrived without the administrative framework he had been applying to every interaction between them since the night of the dinner. He took her hand, not with ceremony, not with declaration. He simply reached across the distance between them and took her hand the way a person reaches for something that is right there and that they have been waiting without fully acknowledging the waiting for the right moment to reach for. She went very still. She did not pull away. She did not say anything. She looked down at their joined hands for a moment with the expression of a woman who is taking the measure of something, determining whether it is real, whether it is what it appears to be, whether it will hold. Then she looked up at him. Her expression was not soft. Exactly. Eleanor's expressions were never soft in the decorative, easily read way of people who had learned to wear their feelings on the surface. But there was something in it that he had not seen before, something that was not the composed, measured attention she applied to everything else. Something that had been waiting the same way he had been waiting behind the 41 pages, and the contractor meetings, and the assembly vote, and the careful, practical, functional architecture of a marriage conducted as a transaction. Edward, she said. Yes. She did not finish the sentence immediately. She looked at him and breathed and let the moment be what it was. Unhurried, neither of them moving to close or extend it. Both of them simply present in it, which was itself something new. The quality of two people who have stopped managing the distance between them and are standing for the first time without it. We should go, she said finally. The train. Yes. He did not let go of her hand. She did not ask him to. They walked toward the street, and the October light was cold and clear above Whitehall, and Eleanor Harrington walked beside her husband through it with her hand in his, and neither of them said anything for a long time, and that too was new. A silence that did not require management, that was not the silence of two strangers cohabiting the same carriage or the same breakfast table or the same carefully organized arrangement. It was just silence. The kind that belongs to people who have said enough for the moment and do not need more words to know where they stand. On the train home with the English countryside, moving past the windows and the compartment lamp burning low and steady. Eleanor took the French history book from her document case. She had brought it because Eleanor brought books, the way other people brought comfort objects, because for her they were the same thing, and she opened it and read, and Edward sat across from her and did not read anything at all. He watched her. He had spent 8 weeks not watching her, not deliberately, not with attention. He had her, the way you look at something that has been assigned a place in the room and that you are satisfied remains in it. He had looked at the surface and called it sufficient. I watched her now, the way you look at something you are only beginning to understand, with the focused, slightly humbled attention of a man who knows that what he is seeing is not the whole of what is there, and who intends this time to keep looking until he has gotten closer to the truth of it. She turned a page. She made a small, involuntary sound. Almost nothing, barely audible, of the kind a person makes when they encounter something in a text that pleases or surprises them, a purely private reaction that she did not perform for anyone. I thought she did not know I heard that. He thought I want to hear it again. I thought I have been living in the same house as this woman for 8 weeks, and I have treated the house as mine, and the woman as an arrangement, and I have been wrong in ways I am still discovering the full dimensions of. And then underneath all of that simpler and more precise, I do not want to be wrong about this anymore. The train moved north through the dark, and Eleanor read, and Edward watched her, and Ashcombe was 2 hours away, and the box of her mother's German letters was there in the room she had been given and had made her own, and the 41 pages were in the estate file with his annotations in the margins, and somewhere between Whitehall and Yorkshire, something had shifted that was not going to shift back. He did not know what to call it yet. He thought that might be all right. He thought that some things did not need to be named before they were real. Eleanor turned another page. Edward kept watching. The lamp burned on. The parliamentary approval came in March. Not spring's end, not the cautious optimism of an expected summer confirmation, but March 5 months ahead of what the Rail Committee had projected under the old framework, 3 weeks after Cresswell had presented the revised submission to the minister, and 4 days after the minister had forwarded it to the approval committee with a recommendation that was by all accounts unambiguous. Hartley brought the letter to Edward at breakfast. Edward read it once, set it on the table, and looked at Eleanor. She already knew from his face. She did not reach for the letter. She waited. Preliminary approval, he said. Full construction authorization pending the final survey, which Cresswell expects to be a formality. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. The revised drainage figures held, she said. They held. He looked at her steadily. You held. She picked up her teacup. Her hands, he noticed, were not entirely steady. A small, almost invisible tremor, the kind that comes not from weakness, but from the release of tension that has been maintained for a very long time. She had been carrying this since October. Since the assembly. Since the 41 pages, and the contractor meeting, and the Whitehall corridor. She had carried it with the composed, relentless competence that was simply how Eleanor moved through the world, and she had not let him see the weight of it. He saw it now. Eleanor. She looked up. Put the teacup down, he said. She did. He reached across the table and covered both her hands with his, and she let him, and they sat there for a moment in the breakfast room of Ashcombe Manor, with the March light coming in, and the approval letter between the toast rack and the marmalade, and neither of them said anything at all, because there was nothing that needed saying that the moment wasn't already saying for them. It was Hartley who gave them the room, who found a reason to be elsewhere for the next 20 minutes with the quiet, loyal discretion of a man who understands that some moments are not administrative. The celebration Edward organized was not a dinner party. He had considered it. He had briefly imagined the practical value of a formal gathering, the assembled county families, the Yorkshire Assembly members, the gesture of public acknowledgement. He had turned the idea over and then set it aside, because the gathering he was imagining was not actually a celebration. It was a demonstration, and Eleanor had spent enough of her life being demonstrated. He took her to Whitmore Valley instead. He told her 2 days before at dinner, simply without elaborate framing. He said he thought they should see it together now that the corridor approval had made its future secure. He said the estate would require decisions in the coming months, and he wanted to make them with her on the ground. She looked at him across the table with the particular careful quality of a woman processing something she had not expected. You want to see it, she said. I want to see it with you. She was quiet for long enough that he registered the quiet. All right, she said finally. Yes. They went on a Thursday, taking the carriage north before sunrise, so that they arrived at Whitmore Valley in the early morning when the mist was still on the lower fields and the house stood against the sky, with the particular character of a place that has been emptied of its daily life, but not of its memory. Eleanor walked ahead of him on the estate path, and he let her, because this was her ground in a way that Ashcombe was not yet, not entirely. Whitmore was the house of her childhood and her father's library, and 20 years of her mother's German letters, and she needed to be in front of it on her own terms before she was ready to be in it with someone else. He watched her stop at the gate. He watched her put her hand on it. He came up beside her and stood, and she did not step away or adjust her position, and the gate was old iron, and the paint had gone in patches, and he knew from the estate records that it had been in this condition for at least 6 years, and that no one had repaired it because there had not been money for paint, and there had not been anyone whose particular responsibility it was to notice. Eleanor had noticed. She had noticed everything here for years with no one to tell. "My father planted those," she said, and she was looking at the tree line along the eastern boundary, a row of oaks that were now substantial and would be magnificent in another 20 years. "He planted them the year I was born. He said they were for me. He meant it genuinely. He was a man who meant things genuinely, and then forgot he had meant them when something more interesting came along." A pause that was not sad exactly, but was very honest. "I tended them for the last 8 years. They look healthy," Edward said. "They are." She turned from the gate. "The eastern ones will need attention to the root drainage this year. The soil in that section retains water in a way that will cause problems in another 5 years if it isn't addressed." He looked at her. "You are already planning the next 5 years." "I am always planning the next 5 years," Eleanor said. The question has only been whether anyone was listening. He felt that direct and accurate and not cruel, the way Eleanor's most precise observations rarely were cruel, despite the fact that they could have been. She was not reproaching him. She was telling him something true about how she had lived and trusting him to hear it for what it was. "I am listening," he said. She held his look for a moment. "I know," she said. "That is why we are here." They walked the estate for 3 hours. She showed him the bridge, the one she had identified the fault in, now repaired according to her specifications. The eastern support beams replaced the structure sound. She showed him the mill and the grain storage and the boundary fencing and the oaks. And she spoke about each with the specific knowledge of a person who has been the only person paying attention for a very long time. And he listened with the full quality of attention he had spent weeks learning to bring to her and which had, somewhere in those weeks, stopped being an effort and become the natural default of a man who has learned that this particular woman is always worth listening to. At the mill. He asked a question she had to think about before answering a question about the water wheel mechanism and the efficiency loss that had been noted in the estate records. And she thought about it with her eyes slightly unfocused in the way she had when she was locating something in the considerable archive of what she had read and learned and observed. And then she gave him the answer and the mechanism behind it. And he asked a follow-up, and she answered that too. And they stood in this mill for 20 minutes, discussing hydraulic efficiency, with the absorbed engagement of two people who have found a shared language and are still pleasantly surprised by the depth of it. On the walk back to the carriage, she said, "What will you do with the house?" He considered the question. "What do you want to do with it?" She looked at him sideways, not with surprise exactly, but with the slight adjustment of a person who has asked a practical question and received an answer that is asking them to be the authority on the subject. "I would keep it," she said. "Not as a working estate, the scale doesn't support it independently any longer. But there are tenants in the valley who have been there for 2 generations. The house could serve as an estate office for the valley management. The land can be productive if it is managed as part of the Harrington Corridor holdings rather than independently." "That is what I was thinking," Edward said. "You were thinking it, or you are agreeing with me." He looked at her. "Both," he said. "In that order." She was quiet for a moment. Then she laughed a short, genuine sound, unguarded in the way that her genuine reactions always were when they broke through the composed surface, and he felt the sound of it, the way you feel unexpected warmth in the chest before you have time to account for it. "All right," she said. "Both." When they returned to Ashcombe that evening, there was a letter waiting. It was from Frederick Vale. Edward saw it on the hall table and picked it up, turned it over. The handwriting was Frederick's. Edward had seen enough of it over 20 years of adjacent social territory to recognize it. He brought it to the library where Eleanor was already settled with the Venetian trade book she had been working through for 3 months, and which she was by his estimate nearly finished with. He sat across from her and opened the letter. He read it. He read it a second time. Then he set it on the table between them and looked at Eleanor, who had put her finger in her book and was watching him with the measured attention of a woman who has learned to read a room by reading the people in it. Frederick is withdrawing his opposition to the corridor expansion, Edward said. Eleanor was still. He had active opposition in process, a petition to the rail committee citing environmental disruption to the southern route. Edward looked at the letter. He filed it in November. He withdrew it this morning. The timeline of it settled over Eleanor like cold water. November, 2 weeks after the assembly, the reorganized response she had anticipated and prepared for, and then in the momentum of the London meeting and the corridor framework, and Cresswell's recommendation had not fully tracked. Frederick had filed a petition to the rail committee in November. If it had been processed, if it had reached the committee before the parliamentary submission, the approval would have been delayed by at minimum 6 months while the environmental assessment was conducted. 6 months. The spring approval would have become a winter approval at best. Why? Eleanor said. It was not a rhetorical question. She was asking specifically why Frederick Vale, a man who had spent 4 months preparing a strategic response to the dinner table humiliation and had deployed it with careful professional precision, had then withdrawn it at the moment of its potential effect. Edward read the relevant section of the letter aloud. I have reviewed the revised corridor framework and the parliamentary submission documentation. The case as constructed is sound. I find that my environmental concerns, while legitimate in principle, do not constitute a material objection to a project that has been demonstrated to be both strategically necessary and financially accurate. I withdraw the petition accordingly. He set the letter down. Eleanor was looking at the middle distance, with the expression she had when she was working through the internal logic of something that had not arrived in the expected form. He read the framework, she said, apparently thoroughly. He withdrew because the argument was correct. A pause. Not because he was obligated to, not because there was social pressure, because he read the work and concluded it was sound. Yes. She was quiet for a long moment. I did not expect that from him, she said. Nor did I. She looked at Edward. It changes my assessment of him, she said. It was simple and direct, the statement of a woman who updates her positions when the evidence warrants it and does not require ceremony around the update. Mine as well, Edward said. He is not a man I have ever fully trusted. He is apparently a man capable of a decision based on merit when the merit is sufficiently clear. Then the work was clear enough. The work was excellent, Edward said. Not with emphasis, not with the careful hedging of a man managing how much he reveals of what he thinks. Plainly. Because it was true, and she had been told it by Cresswell, and by Harland, and by Sir William. And he was not going to be the person in her life who withheld the plain statement of a plain fact. It was the best work I have seen produced on the corridor in 4 years, and I have reviewed everything. Eleanor looked at him. She did not deflect. She did not perform modesty or reframe the compliment. She received it the way she received accurate information about anything directly, with the honest acknowledgement of a person who is not in the habit of pretending things are other than what they are. Thank you, she said. You are welcome, he said. Eleanor. She was still looking at him. There is something I want to say to you, he said. And I want to say it correctly, so I am going to ask for a moment. She waited. She was very good at waiting. The patient, unrushed quality of a woman who had spent years in rooms where the thing she was waiting for did not come, and who had learned not to rush the moment when it finally arrived. He took the moment. I told you in October that I didn't know what this was becoming, he said. That I knew what it had been, and was less certain about what it was. I said that as though the uncertainty were the honest answer. I think it was a convenient one. She said nothing. I think I knew, he said. I think I knew in the library in October, and on the train from London, and this morning at the mill, when you were explaining the water wheel, and you stopped in the middle of a sentence because you had a new thought, and you went to find it, and then came back and finished. I think I have known for some time what this is. I have been taking a long time to say it, because saying it requires me to be certain, and I have not in my life said things I was not certain of. Eleanor's hands were still in her lap. Are you certain now? Her voice was steady and quiet, and entirely her own, with none of the social management that other women applied to moments like this. No softening, no performance of receptivity, just the direct question of a woman who wants the accurate answer. Yes, he said. She breathed. Then say it, she said. I love you, Edward said. Not the arrangement, not the land or the work or the things you have done for this estate that I did not know to ask for. I love the woman who carried her mother's letters in a box out of a failing house and taught herself Italian because the translations were incomplete, and sat at a dinner table in Yorkshire and let a man make a fool of himself in German before she answered him with perfect precision. He paused. I love the woman who wrote 41 pages when I asked for an assessment of 3 contracts because she had already looked at all 7 and saw no reason to give me less than the complete picture. Eleanor was very still. I married your land, he said. I am asking you now whether you would consider being married to me. The silence that followed was not the silence of a woman deliberating. He understood this almost immediately from the quality of her stillness. It was not the stillness of uncertainty, but the stillness of a person who has arrived somewhere. They were not entirely sure they would reach, and who is taking a moment to be in it before they respond. She looked at him with the clear, direct, undeflected gaze that he had come to understand was the most Eleanor thing about her. The look that saw things as they were, and did not require them to be otherwise. You have been married to me, she said, for 8 months. You have been learning what that means for approximately 6 of them. A pause that was precise rather than cruel. I have been watching you learn. I know. I did not make it easy. You made it accurate, he said. That is what I needed. I did not know that when we began. She was quiet. I did not expect, Eleanor said slowly, choosing each word with the care she gave to precise things, to be known. Not in this. I expected to be useful. I expected to be respected eventually if the work was sufficient. I did not expect to be... She stopped. She tried again. I did not expect a man who would ask me what Whitmore Valley was like to grow up in. I did not expect someone to remember that I had told him the oaks needed root drainage attention, and to ask about it today when we were standing there. A breath. I did not expect to be remembered. I understood what she was saying. Not the surface of it, the words, but the thing beneath them, which was that Eleanor Whitmore had spent her adult life being competent in rooms that did not expect competence from her, and had made herself sufficient in circumstances that asked nothing of her but compliance, and had never not once been in a room with a person who wanted to know her the way you know something you intend to keep. I am going to spend a considerable amount of time, he said, making up for the first 8 weeks. Eleanor looked at him. That is not necessary, she said. I know it isn't necessary. I intend to do it regardless. Something moved across her face. Not the small controlled expressions she managed in public rooms, the composed reactions of a woman who had learned to keep her interior life private. Something freer than that. Something that had been waiting behind the 41 pages, and the contractor meetings, and the measured, careful architecture of a woman who had decided not to need things she was not going to be given. She reached across the table. She picked up his hand. She held it the way he had held hers on the Whitehall pavement. Not with declaration, not with performance. Just with the simple, direct intention of a person who has decided that the distance between them has become unnecessary and has chosen to close it. Yes, she said. He looked at her. Yes. Yes, Eleanor said again. I would consider being married to you. The word consider, deployed with its precise irony, made him laugh, a short, genuine sound that he was not in the habit of producing in drawing rooms or libraries, or anywhere that other people could hear it, but which arrived now without his managing it. She smiled. Not the small, controlled curve of social courtesy. A real smile, the kind he had seen in flashes at the mill, on the train, in the library, over the Venetian trade book. The full, unguarded expression of a woman who has decided she is safe enough to let someone see it. He had seen her face in composed repose, and in professional concentration, and in the precise, directed focus of her competence. He had not seen this. He thought he would like to spend a considerable amount of time seeing this. The months that followed were the months in which Ashcombe Manor changed. Not in its physical arrangement. The rooms were the same rooms, the grounds the same grounds. But the quality of the house changed the way the quality of a house always changes when the people in it are not merely occupying the same space, but actually living in it together with the specific accumulating intimacy of two people who have decided to know each other and are in the ongoing daily practice of that decision. Eleanor moved her books into the main library, which she had previously used only during working hours and which now held along the east wall the French and Italian and German volumes that had traveled with her from Whitmore, alongside the 3 decades of her mother's Hamburg letters, now in their box on the second shelf where she could reach them without standing. Edward did not comment on the rearrangement of the library. He noticed every book. He noticed which ones she returned to the Venetian trade history, finished in December, and started again in January, because she had decided there was a second reading in it. He noticed when she fell asleep over a volume of German philosophy on a Thursday evening, and woke with the book on her chest, and said entirely without self-consciousness that Hegel was better suited to mornings, and then went upstairs. He noticed the small annotations she made in margins, the quick, precise marks of a reader who is in conversation with the text, and he began tentatively, and with the awareness that he was doing something new, to read the same books, and look for the marks, and understand what she had found there. She found him once on a Sunday afternoon reading her annotated copy of the Venetian history. She stood in the library door and looked at him for a moment without speaking. "There is a note on page 212, he said without looking up, "about the relationship between the merchant class and the nobility. You've written, 'This is always the real tension.' What did you mean?" Eleanor came into the library and sat in her chair. "I meant," she said, "that the official history is about trade routes and alliances, but the actual tension in every chapter is about who has the knowledge and who has the authority, and whether those two things will ever end up in the same hands." He looked at her. "And do they?" "In the book." "Sometimes," she said, "when the people involved are paying attention." He looked back at the page. "Page 212, he said. "Are we past page 212? Eleanor looked at him with the clear, direct gaze that he still found 8 months in to be the most disarming thing about her, the look that refused comfort and chose accuracy instead. "We are past page 212, she said. "We are somewhere in the later chapters." "Which are better?" "Considerably," Eleanor said. "The early ones are about people trying to manage a situation. The later ones are about people who have stopped managing and started building." He set the book down. He looked at her across the library. This woman who had walked into his house carrying a box of her mother's letters and a 41-page capacity for attention, that he had almost entirely missed this woman who had sat at his dinner table in midnight blue and answered a German insult with the composed precision of someone who had decided long before he was paying attention exactly who she was. "Then let's build," he said. Eleanor held his look. "We already are," she said. "We have been for months." She was right. She was as she was in all things she applied her attention to precisely right. He had married her land in June. He had begun to know her in October. He had loved her. He could identify it now, retroactively, in the accumulating evidence of all those mornings and meetings and evenings in the library far sooner than he had said so. The northern corridor broke ground in April, 18 months after Eleanor had found the 1882 survey in the misfiled drawer of the Ashcombe estate file room. The parliamentary approval was formal and uncontested. Cresswell sent a note to Eleanor directly to the Duchess of Ashcombe, with no secondary address to the Duke, thanking her for the framework, and noting that the minister had cited the strategic framing specifically in his approval recommendation. She showed Edward the note over breakfast, the same way he had shown her the approval letter 4 months before, set it on the table between them, without preamble, without performance. He read it. He set it down. "The minister cited you," he said. "The minister cited the framework. The framework is yours." "The framework," Eleanor said precisely, "is ours. I wrote it. You gave it a room to stand in." He looked at her for a long moment. She was right about that too. She was in the habit of being right, and he was in the habit now of knowing it and not needing to manage his response to it, not needing to qualify or reframe or find the version of her correctness that left more room for his own. She was right. He had given the work a room to stand in. She had done the work. Both things were true, and neither diminished the other, and they had learned over the months of the later chapters to hold both truths at once, without requiring one to be smaller so the other could be larger. That was what Ashcombe Manor had become. Not the house where the Duke managed and the Duchess complied. Not the arrangement where the land was the point and the woman who came with it was administrative. Not two people conducting a transaction and calling it a life. Two people who had started in the wrong place and found their way through 41 pages and a contractor meeting and a Yorkshire assembly and a Whitehall corridor and a train ride home in October, with one lamp burning to the right one. In May, Eleanor received a letter from a solicitor in Hamburg, a firm she had written to in January, at the conclusion of research she had not mentioned to Edward until the letter arrived. Her grandmother's family in Hamburg, her mother's side, 3 generations back. She had tracked them through the German correspondence in the letters' names and addresses that had accumulated in the margins of 30 years of family news, and she had written to a Hamburg legal firm, asking whether any of the family was still in contact with the Whitmore connection. 2 cousins were. A woman named Anna, who was 61, and who had it emerged from the subsequent correspondence been writing to Eleanor's mother, until 6 months before her death letters, that had somehow not survived the Whitmore papers. And a younger man, Anna's son, who was a musician, and who knew 3 languages, and who wrote to Eleanor in German that was warmer and more informal than anything she had encountered in her formal reading, and which made her sit at the breakfast table with the letter in her hands, and an expression that Edward, watching her from across the table, recognized as the thing she looked like when something mattered. "What is it?" he said. She looked up. She told him. He watched her face as she described the letters, the cousins, the 30-year gap in the correspondence that had closed itself. He watched her hold the letter from Anna's son, a young man writing in his grandmother's kitchen in Hamburg, about a connection to an English cousin he had not known existed, with the careful hands of someone who has been given something fragile and is being precise about how she holds it. "You will write back," he said. "Of course." In German. She looked at him with the expression that was almost a smile. "Obviously," she said. He reached across the table. She gave him the letter. He read it slowly because his German was functional rather than fluent, the German of a man who had read enough for business purposes and not enough for warmth, and the warmth in this letter required attention. When he finished, he handed it back. "He sounds like someone worth knowing," Edward said. "He does," Eleanor agreed. "Invite them," he said. "Anna and her son, to Ashcombe." Eleanor went very still. "Edward, this house is large enough for family," he said. "It has been large enough for some time. It has simply lacked the people to fill it correctly." He looked at her steadily. "Invite them." She looked at him for a long moment, the full, undeflected look, the one that saw everything and did not require it to be other than what it was. Then she said, "You are certain?" "I am certain." "You have never met them?" "I have not," he said. "I intend to." She looked down at the letter. She breathed. "All right," she said. "Yes." That afternoon, she wrote 3 letters, one to Anna in Hamburg, one to Anna's son, whose name was Friedrich, and one to the Hamburg solicitor, formally acknowledging the family connection. She wrote all 3 in German, and Edward sat in the library with his own correspondence and listened to the scratch of her pen from across the room, and the afternoon was entirely ordinary and entirely sufficient and entirely theirs. In the evening she came to stand beside him at the library window, the one that looked north across the grounds toward the tree line. The same window where she had stood the night of the dinner while he found his way down the corridor to her. He stood beside her. She did not step away or adjust her position. "Frederick sent a note," she said. "He is sponsoring the corridor's public announcement dinner next month. He has asked whether the Duchess of Ashcombe would be willing to speak to the strategic framework." Edward turned to look at her. "Frederick Vale is asking you to speak at a public dinner." "He is." A pause. "I suspect he has calculated that the association is now more advantageous than the alternative." "That is almost certainly accurate." "It is entirely accurate," Eleanor said. "Frederick makes decisions based on advantage. I respect that more than decisions made from pride." He looked at her profile, the clean, direct line of it. The composed certainty of a woman who had been in rooms with people making decisions from pride her entire life and had learned to distinguish it from everything more solid. "Will you do it?" he asked. "Yes," Eleanor said. "On one condition." He waited. "You sit in the front row," she said. "And you do not take notes. I want you to simply listen." He understood what she was asking. Not just the practical thing, not just his attention, his presence. She was asking him to be there the way he had not been in the first weeks, the way he had learned to be and intended to keep being. She was asking him to witness it. "I will be there," he said. "I know," Eleanor said. "That is why I asked." She turned back to the window. He stood beside her. Outside the grounds were still, and the northern sky was the particular deep blue of a Yorkshire evening in late spring, and the tree line was green, and somewhere behind them. In the house a door opened and closed, and Mrs. Calloway's footsteps moved through the corridor with the evening schedule, and the house was alive around them in all the ordinary ways that a house is alive when it is genuinely inhabited. Eleanor Harrington, Duchess of Ashcombe, stood at the window of her library in the manner that was hers. Not the ledger, entry hers of a land agreement, not the contractual hers of a transaction concluded in a solicitor's office, but hers in the full and irreversible sense of a woman who has learned a house from its file room outward, and has decided with the precision she applied to everything she decided to remain in it. Beside the man who had taken too long to see her, and had not once he saw her looked away. They had started in the wrong place. Most people did. The question was never whether you started correctly, it was whether you were willing to do the work of finding your way to something true. They had done the work. They were still doing it. And that Eleanor knew, with the same clear certainty she brought to survey data and parliamentary frameworks and the load-bearing specifications of a bridge that did not need to be replaced, was exactly as it should be.